Great. Well, I want to begin by thanking everyone for coming out this evening for what I think is going to be a very interesting discussion about spirituality and its different forms it takes in an age where there's growing non-religion, or at least disaffiliation from traditional forms of religion. I think it'll be a very interesting discussion, and hopefully you'll be a part of it. I'm going to ask our guests here some questions for about half an hour, and then we're going to open it up for everyone to be part of the conversation. So I want to also thank our guest speaker, Tara Isabella Burton, for coming here to engage with us in this conversation, particularly in relation to her book, Strange Rites, New Religions in a Godless World. So this is the book right here. It's a very nice book. I encourage you to read it if you haven't read it already. Hopefully this conversation will help pique your interest in the book. So Dr. Burton is a novelist and a leading cultural commentator, received a doctorate in theology from Oxford University in 2017. She is currently a visiting fellow at George Mason University's Marcatus Center and a visiting research fellow at Catholic University of America's Institutional Flourishing Lab. Besides Strange Rites, she is also the author of Self-Made, Curating Our Image from Da Vinci to the Kardashians. That was with Public Affairs in 2023. Along with 3 novels, Social Creature, published with Doubleday in 2018, The World Cannot Give with Simon & Schuster in 2022, and Here in Avalon, Simon & Schuster, 2024. She's currently working on A History of Magic and Modernity to be published with Convergent in 2026. Her fiction and nonfiction work has appeared in the New York Times, National Geographic, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. She also co-writes a Substack called Lines of Beauty with her husband, Donna J. Jagannathan, who's a philosopher. I already gave the name of the Substack, Lines of Beauty. Who's a philosopher at Columbia University, and like me, he's an Aristotelian philosopher, the very best kind. We're glad we have that connection as well. And I also want to thank the Hamilton Center at UF and everyone who's been involved in helping make this possible, particularly Cheryl and Emily, who've been helping me out a lot, and also our director, Will Imboden, for his financial support. And I also want to thank the John Templeton Foundation for their generosity in making this possible, along with the Department of Religion for co-sponsoring this event tonight. This public event is part of a grant project that I'm leading called Spiritual Yearning and the Problem of Spiritual Alienation in connection... Oh, sorry, is it good? So the grant project is called Spiritual Yearning and the Problem of Spiritual Alienation in connection with Templeton's Spiritual Yearning Research Initiative, which seeks to explore the search for meaning among the non-religious. This will be the first of 3 public events. Our second event is upcoming in 2 weeks on November 19th with leading philosopher of religion, John Cottingham, who will give a lecture on philosophy of religion in an age of growing non-religion. So you can find the information about that on the Hamilton Center website on events. So I hope everyone will also be able to make it out to that event. Our final event we're working on, it will be a public conversation with Senator Marco Rubio and Senator Chris Murphy, who are on different sides of the political aisle on the place of faith and spirituality in public life today, which I think, especially following on election, is particularly important to find common languages and ways of bridging our political divides. And so keep an eye out for that. We're trying to aim for the spring semester. We'll see how that all works out. So we'll keep you posted. Of course, I want to thank all my students for coming out here today. Thank you very much. And I'm sure they're going to be peaked with some really good questions because we've been talking about the search for meaning in a secular age. And so we've been having a lot of great conversations already. So to begin, I want to frame our conversation in terms of what has been called the rise of the nuns. So maybe some of you have heard of this expression, the rise of the nuns. It's not the religious women who, they're not like rising up with, in rebellion, it's nuns as an N-O-N-E-S, those who say they have no religious affiliation. So in surveys, these are the people who say they don't have a religious affiliation. In the U.S., the percentage of nuns was at 1 to 2% from 1948 to 1967. 1948 was when this started being tracked consistently. But starting in 1968, it rose to a new baseline of 6 to 9% until 2001, when it began to spike such that the number has more than doubled to around 25% currently. And with younger people, it's even higher. It's something more like 1 1/3 younger people from 18 to 29 now say they have no religious affiliation. So in essence, it's the fastest growing religious or non-religious category, right? Explanations for the rise of the nuns include the sexual revolution of the 1960s and subsequent culture wars, the end of the Cold War, which involved fighting godless communism, as it was often referred to, the rise of concern with religious fundamentalism after 9/11, moral failings of religious leaders, and the rise of the internet, which figures quite prominently in Tara's work, as we'll be discussing. Of course, many people continue to belong to traditional religious traditional religions, I should say, but we will be considering here the prospects and challenges for the contemporary spiritual seeker. Tara, I think one of the most important contributions of your book is that it shows the depth and variety of spiritual yearnings among those who are called nuns, or those who are religiously unaffiliated. Oftentimes, such people will say that they are spiritual but not religious, but in fact, you suggest that they still may be religious after all, but with a new kind of religion, hence the subtitle for your book, New Religions in a Godless World. And so there is a sense in which we do not live in a secular age, at least as some might think of it. So before beginning to explore some of these new religions, could you first explain how you understand the concept of religion? So this is sort of the million-dollar question here. How are we going to understand religion? For saying there's these new religions, how are we understanding religion exactly? So you want to say a little bit about how you understand religion? And I should say, join me in welcoming Tara Isabella Burton.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. I'm delighted to be here. So in Strange Rites, I don't try to define religion. I think as anyone who has attempted the study of religions knows, there are as many definitions of religion as there are religious scholars, and I don't claim to make a programmatic definition. But one of the things that I wanted to explore in the book is perhaps not what is a religion, but what are some of the traditional features of religious life that are replicated by some of these contemporary secular-y, spiritual-y phenomena. And actually, I think the fact that they are seen as components, which are themselves separable from one another, is kind of part of the story I'm telling. So what are some of the ways that religion has traditionally figured in people's social and individual psychological lives? One of them, one of the central ones is meaning, a sense of what is it all for? How do I see the overall workings of the world? It's in the arc, if any, of history, so on and so forth. The second, closely related to it, is purpose. Where do I fit into the story of meaning? What is my individual role as a human being, as myself, within that wider story? Community, that one's pretty self-explanatory. But also ritual. What are the specific actions that I can take with perhaps my community in order to reify that sense of meaning and purpose? And one of the stories that I want to tell in Strange Rites is not just that there are other phenomena with these four characteristics, but rather that actually to be, whether you are spiritual but not religious explicitly on the form, that's the box you check, that's often about 20% of Americans, or whether you are someone who ticks a different box on the form but perhaps has a spiritual life that is a little more complicated, a little more diffuse, or even if you are sort of a traditionally religious person, you are probably swimming in the cultural soup, I like Charles Taylor's social imaginary as a phrase, that normalizes not just this idea of what I call in the book religious remixing, that you're taking a little from column A, a little from column B, you're getting your meaning from one place and your purpose from another, and maybe a sense of community from a third, and ritual from one of the above or from more than one. But actually that the very way of thinking about religious remixing is based in a set of assumptions, a theological world picture. And I think that I think there's two ways of interpreting strange rites, or interpreting the landscape that I see, which is that we are not in a quote-unquote secular age, we are in a more religious, just fragmented age. And one of them is to say, well, there's a lot of different contemporary religions anyone can pick from, or religious adjacent practices that people are picking and choosing from. Oh, there's yoga here and sage cleansing here and tarot there. And this is something I don't explicitly talk about in Strange Rites as much. I think my later work builds on this, and this book I'm working on about magic and modernity most of all, is that there's actually a theological picture of the world implicit in the idea that religious remixing is not just possible, but in fact desirable, the norm. And I think that implicit idea is that we find some kind of authoritative theological truth. The closest we can get to the divine is by looking inward, by investigating our own affective states, our own desires, and kind of going with what feels good. And that's obviously a simplistic way of putting it, but that the role of the spiritual seeker is to look within and then sort of go out into the world and find those practices, those rituals, those senses of community, those groups that dovetail with that.
Yeah, no, that's great. So yeah, you have this. So I want to get into it with a few more of the examples that you discuss in the book. So I mean, part of what I hear you saying is that there's sort of this concern with authenticity, self-creation. These are bespoke religions or bespoke identities, we might say, something that we sort of craft them for ourselves, as it were. So you discuss a number of interesting examples, including, for instance, Harry Potter fandom as maybe contributing to maybe this religious remixing, wellness culture, sort of the self-care elements of wellness culture, occultism, including witchcraft, sexual utopianism, movements around polyamory, free love, kink, and so forth, and then some more encompassing doctrines which maybe try to meet all, these. You talk about these four components of religion in terms of meaning, purpose, community, ritual. So we have what you call social justice culture. There's techno-utopianism. Another utopianism enters the fray here, and then also kind of atavism that maybe we see particularly if social justice culture is sort of on the left, a kind of atavistic, trying to recover sort of biological roots that maybe are covered over by a corrupted civilization. Mm-hmm. So these are all trying to present maybe alternative religious doctrines to traditional perspectives. So could you, maybe say a little bit more about the sort of bespoke aspect of these, or if you want to maybe focus on one in particular, like how is Harry Potter, like how could that be a religion? Like
Sure.
Someone might say, like, is Harry Potter really a religion, or is this just like, make believe or pretend?
So I don't think it's not a religion per se, but the cultural phenomenon that was Harry Potter fandom had, I think, an absolutely outsized cultural impact in this contemporary landscape of religious remixing, and the reason is the internet. So I say early on in the book, I still think this, that what the printing press did for the Protestant Reformation, the internet has done for this remixed religious sensibility. And the story of Harry Potter fandom is the story of early internet fandom. I think, it does not necessarily have to do with the content of the books themselves, except insofar as they're sort of like Star Wars, a little bit generic enough to kind of allow for a lot of interpretation. It's it's a big, broad, sweeping themes. We all love a good and evil story, what have you. But before Harry Potter, major fandoms, I'm thinking of Star Trek in particular, or Star Wars, if you were a fan, it was a kind of high, not dollar cost of entry, but like a high effort cost of entry thing to do. You were, finding ways to seek out other fans. You were involved in zines. You were going to conventions. You kind of had to be a big nerd to want to do it and to be able to do it. Something that happened around the time that Harry Potter was gaining fans, getting adherents, it was that the personal internet in your home was increasingly something that you had. I think it's between the third and the fourth books of Harry Potter. Home internet access in the United States goes up something like 900%. I don't remember the exact number. It's been a while, but it's what ends up happening then is for the first time you have a kind of fan community that is using the tools of this new disembodied space to create a community of affinity and to priming themselves to think about this text not as authoritative in any formally way, but as a kind of base on which to riff. There's, fan fiction has been something that exists in previous fan communities, but it absolutely explodes with Harry Potter. Everybody has their own vision of how it should go or who these characters should end up with romantically or just sexually. A lot of fan fiction is sort of erotic in nature. But what ends up happening is that fan culture as a phenomenon becomes a site of freewheeling creativity, of reimagining story, of you don't like this ending, you can just change it, and this sort of dovetails with the ethos of, an ethos that already existed in the early internet, which was not as widely adopted, but now is sort of becoming something that any teenage, usually girl, but not exclusively, with a at-home internet connection can access. And this goes beyond initially Harry Potter fandom. It sort of becomes normal for all fandoms, and indeed fandom becomes one of these very common ways that pretty much anyone can plug into a broader cultural ecosystem. Whatever is going on at your school or your job, you are connected through whichever fandom is your fandom to this creative community of people reimagining what a story can be. And there's sort of many ways that fan culture has persisted into the present day, including sort of the sense that cultural products are made for the fans, or that fans have certain kind of authoritative power over artistic creators. And again, to some extent, that's not new. Arthur Conan Doyle tried to kill off Sherlock Holmes, and there was a fan outcry then, and he took it back. But the scale at which cultural production is sort of tied up with what the fans want, and the way in which what the fans want is often conceived as a sort of the story going the way they have it in their heads is tied up with the medium of the internet. And this is important, I think, for the story of the spiritual but not religious, because that way of thinking about stories that now several generations, or at least a couple of generations, are growing up with or have grown up with, becomes a kind of basis for thinking about religious stories, about myths. There's a kind of field of bricolage where what you're doing is you're taking from cultural properties, cultural myths, existing narratives, and encouraged to, and this is true in every area of our lives, not just religious, to make up something that works for us. And particularly in the slightly later internet of, let's say, the algorithm-driven internet that is largely on particular platforms, that's only intensified. You log into your social media feed and you're seeing news that is curated for you. You are logging into Netflix and you're seeing films to watch that are curated for you. You're logging into Amazon, same thing. Advertisements for things you might like are following you around the web. Your entire experience of digital life, which is increasingly for many of us more and more of our real life, is curated for you. why should religion be any different? And so I see Harry Potter fandom not as a religion in itself, but as a sort of canary in the coal mine for a cultural shift that is as much about the technology of the internet as it is about whatever's in the Harry Potter books. Although I do sometimes joke that all the evangelicals were so worried that Harry Potter would turn people into kids into witches, and they were in fact right, just not in the way that they thought they would be.
No, that's great. I want to ultimately come back, kind of culminating in a discussion of this idea of writing our own scripts and sort of the role of consumer capitalism in a lot of these new spiritualities, including wellness culture and so forth. But I want to try to, before going to some of those maybe more critical questions, I want to maybe go to the kind of broader historical perspective of, you make a distinction between intuitional religion and institutional religion. And that, in fact, a lot of these new religions are they're firmly on the side of the intuitional, as contrasted with the institutional, in fact, oftentimes distancing themselves from the institutional religions. Hence, they will say they're spiritual but not religious. And I think one of the interesting things in the book is that you see this as kind of an American story. That, I mentioned going back to the 50s, but there's a long tradition of sort of intuitional religion, of awakenings, trying to recover some sense of personal piety against sort of the deadening influence potentially of institutions. Although, of course, one of the questions I want to ask you related to this is, it seems that there's a necessary relationship between institutions and the intuitional side. And hence, a lot of these new religions become religion-like as they end up taking on certain kinds of institutions. So I wonder if you might place this sort of new interest in kind of the intuitional side in that broader American landscape of religion. And then ultimately, how do we think about this institutional versus intuitional? I know, like William James, in his Varieties of Religious Experience, thought, he kind of shared in this kind of anti-institutional sense, and thought you had these like religious geniuses who had these experiences which were the bedrock of religious experience. But he didn't quite have a place for religious institutions. But it seems like your argument is in fact that they end up adopting some kind of institutional framework, one way or the other. So first question again is just to try to say a little bit more about this dichotomy between institutional and intuitional religion and its place in American history. Sorry, that's a big question, but...
So I think, and it's not exclusively true of the United States. You have these sort of intuitionalist movements, theosophists and what have you throughout Europe as well. And that's, again, we're just limiting ourselves to the sort of European and American Western Christian tradition here for the purposes of not biting off more than we can chew conversationally. But America in particular I think the American religious landscape has been marked by this constant tension, this pendulum swing between what I call intuitionalist and institutionalist, say that 10 times fast, these polarities of religious observance. And you find this narrative over and over from in however many great awakenings. I think I've lost count on how many we're actually on. But from Methodist circuit writers to the rise of Billy Graham and American evangelicalism, the narrative goes over and over something like this. Those people who go and fill the pews every Sunday, they're doing what they are doing because society expects it. But what they lack is a real, a true, an inner, an emotional faith, a personal relationship with the divine, with God. And then if you count the 60s counterculture as a great awakening, the divine maybe not understood with as synonymous with the Christian God. There needs to be some kind of emotional true component, and these institutions are desiccated and offer us nothing and simply are a form of social compliance. And at its best, this can result in incredible flowerings of mysticism, of religious feeling. But it is also true that one of the things that institutions, I won't say are supposed to do well and historically have sometimes done well, is figure out how something like a religious, or make such phenomena sustainable, particularly beyond the point, say, of a charismatic individual's lifespan. So there's often, and it does feel that this is a distinctly American phenomenon that, for whatever reason, and I think there are many, Americans tend to want and hunger for some degree of intuitional, affective intensity in their spiritual life, and see a religion as falling short if it does not offer that. And certainly that was, you could see that in the flourishing of the burnt over districts and in upstate New York in the Great Awakenings, and I think you can see that very much in the 60s counterculture. Some of the language is very much the same. I think we can call this moment we're in now another Great Awakening. And what is actually really interesting, one of the things that I was most shocked to discover when I was doing the research for this book, I came thinking, we're going to find the biggest people who, the most leavers, the most people who grew up in a religious tradition and become a nun in adulthood. They're going to be the people who are running away from fundamentalism. They're going to be the people who thought, oh, this is too much, this is too intense, I don't like this, I hate religion now. That's not true. One of the most reliable indicators of becoming a religious nun in adulthood is growing up sort of religious-ish, but like where your parents take a box on the form, but religion is not discussed at home. So the people who are leaving institutional religion behind, with one big exception, queer Americans are wherever you are in the sort of acronym of that, are much more likely to leave organized religion. I think it's about 46%. But otherwise, the other kind of story that tends to happen is you grew up knowing your parents were religious for some kind of social reason. Okay, you go to Christmas and Easter, it's what everyone does. And then as an adult, the feeling seems to be, well, our parents didn't really believe, they just did it because it was expected, and now we don't have to, so why bother? Which is, I think, something important to contextualize, that maybe the phenomenon we're looking at now is not people suddenly moving away from religion. It's just people making explicit what perhaps has been true for at least a couple of generations, if not more, that their institutional religion in some or many cases is not necessarily offering robust theological engagement or spiritual experience.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think this phrase, spiritual but not religious, is an interesting one, but I think kind of to the point of what you're saying, it's like when people get really serious about the spiritual life, they take up spiritual practices, and they do regularly, and then they often do it with others, and so it starts looking eerily similar to a religion. And so that's why I think probably we can't make any strong distinction between spirituality and religion, although it does bring out a certain kind of, when someone says that, I think it indicates they're not maybe happy with the current options, and they're a spiritual seeker in some sense. And so, I want to ask one further question before opening up to sort of a general conversation with everyone here, whoever wants to join in. It'd be wonderful to have your thoughts, reflections, and questions. So the book is largely descriptive. You don't give a prescriptive sort of, this is where we should go, right? But at the same time, there does seem to be a kind of maybe implicit criticism of a lot of these new religions. So for instance, along the way, there seems to be this implicit critique that they're oftentimes too self-focused or individualistic. So for instance, wellness culture, this sort of focus on self-care, maybe too influenced by consumer capitalism, maybe too concerned with being transgressive, subversive, or disruptive in some way. And I think here of Alyosha Karamazov, who says one cannot live on rebellion alone, right? So is it parasitic on kind of what it's critiquing? Does it have enough resources of its own? It may be in some ways ultimately nihilistic. You raise this particularly with regard to wellness culture. There's kind of an underlying nihilism perhaps in wellness culture and this focus on self-care. And I think you also mentioned that with regard to sort of certain maybe extreme forms of the atavistic right. So I wonder if you might be willing to make this critique a little bit more explicit for us here. As I'm the philosopher, I like to bring out maybe the critical thrust that seems to be there. And then sort of projecting forward, I mean, what might a healthy version look like? Because I think part of the problem I take with the self-focus critique, I think someone might say, you can't really have a spirituality if it doesn't have something self-transcending that you see as making demands upon you, that you see as restraining your desires in some way. If there's nothing demanding of you, or like if there's nothing worth choosing and it makes demands upon you, then in a way there's nothing worth choosing. So I think that worry about nihilism or the sort of loss of meaning sort of like lurks behind all of the self-focus, that it's really like if it's just about self, nothing beyond it, then there's like nothing worth choosing, nothing worth desiring, the sense of like there's demands upon us to which we need to be responsive. And so I found that very interesting, and I wonder if you generally agree with like any sort of over self-focused perspective is going to have that problem. Just to give one example, famously in Robert Bella's Habits of the Heart, Individualism and Commitment in America, it's talking about these individualistic religions. There's this woman, Sheila, who has her own religion called Sheilaism, right? And it sort of tests whether like, could Sheilaism really be a religion, or could it really be a spirituality, right? So there might be this worry, insofar as these new religions are self-focused or sort of kind of individualistic, always trying to create your own script, it's all about individual choice, can they be at least healthy spiritualities, or vibrant ones, or ones that can be self-sustaining without falling into that sort of nihilistic trap? I know I gave you a lot there, but that was my sort of like, there seems to be a lurking critique here, and I think I'm sympathetic with it. So I wonder if you fill it out and kind of, what would the healthy form look like?
Absolutely. So first of all, I am very happy to be more explicit in my critique than I was in Strange Rites. Strange Rites was written 5 years ago now. I came out in 2020, but was written in 2019. And I think since then, I have felt that the trends that I identify have only intensified. The pandemic was a real watershed moment in terms of, I think, the internetification of life, creating this sort of, the internet became all the more a site of not just spiritual yearning, but spiritual weirdness. That's a subject for my current book. And I want to answer your question, sort of break it down in a few different ways. So before I roughly agree with you, which is to say I do see serious problems with what you call the implicit self-focus of the remixed religion, something that I will build upon in a second. I do want to make one very important caveat, because I think it's very easy to come at this question and think, well, millennials are all selfish, and now it's, I guess, Zoomers, they barely existed when I was writing this book, and the Zoomers, they're even more selfish, and this is all a religion of narcissism. And I think a really key component here is the breakdown of public trust, and particular public trust in institutions. I think we are looking at a couple of generations now who perceive, I think rightly, that they have been failed by nearly every major institution around them, from individual religious institutions. I'm thinking of the Catholic Church's sex abuse scandals, and indeed sort of sex abuse scandals in a number of Protestant churches and denominations as well, but also the political establishment, the journalistic establishment, the scientific establishment. There's no institution that has retained public trust. And if you look at studies, and now even the studies that I cited in Strange Rites are themselves out of date at this point, generationally, pretty much any institution you can name, the military, the police, the government, there is a huge drop-off between members of, let's say, the greatest generation and members of the, I was going to say, the millennials who were the youngest when I was writing, and now Generation Z. And if you do not trust outside institutions and outside authorities, outside institutions and authorities have failed that trust, it is incredibly logical for the next step to be to assume that looking inward rather than outward is the most reliable source of an authority, because the logic would go, at least I know I'm not lying to myself. Now, I think as a theologian, I would say, the heart is deceitful above all things. We lie to ourselves all the time, but it perhaps emotionally feels easier to deal with than someone else lying to you. So with that caveat, I do think there's a very intense nihilism to remix religion that is implicit in, and I don't know, I'm myself torn, like, does it have to be there or not? But here is the sort of metaphysical system, or the theological world picture, a phrase I quite like, of what I see as the sort of religion of modernity that is implicit, underlying a lot of remixing culture. It's something that you find in sort of new aginess, but it's broader than that. And that is that there's some kind of energy force out there in the universe, that there's a divine reality that, maybe there's a sort of personal God out there, but mostly it's more of a force. And that force can be best understood or accessed by some kind of internal spiritual exploration where our own desires, perhaps even linked to our erotic desires, there's an erotic component of that, can help us get in touch with those energies and perhaps even manipulate them. So, for example, manifesting, contemporary phenomenon, quick show of hands, who here has heard of manifesting? Okay, good, I don't need to explain it. It's very much downstream of a 19th century phenomenon known as New Thought. But more broadly, and this is the book I'm writing now, there are actual sort of intellectual and theological traditions that hold to that. I actually think the Western esoteric tradition, more commonly known as magic, is actually a really interesting, consistent place that these ideas are explored in this way, this idea of human self-transcendence, of human even becoming God, theosis, through inner and outer knowledge. If you were here at my lecture last night, you heard me talk about the Hermetic tradition and how it's the key to understanding the modern world. If you weren't there last night, just read my next book when it comes out. But I do think that there is I think that there is a consistent way of looking at the world that is in fact a religious sensibility in and of itself, beyond just, it's self-focused because people are self-focused now. That said, I think traditionally, when you assume that our internally felt desires and energies can get you in touch with the universe, there's a sort of Neoplatonic version, which is sort of intellectually fascinating, but it often is indistinguishable from, I am the closest thing there is to God in the world, or my emotional state is the closest thing there is to the divine. And maybe it is, in fact, divine. And certainly, again, going back to the history of the sort of esoteric tradition, you do find magicians like Aleister Crowley making that implicit idea explicit, that this is a sort of religion of will. I don't think it always necessarily has to go that far, but I think sort of self-divinization, maybe because it's implicit in the ideology, maybe it's because it's human nature to be really selfish, does tend to ultimately divinize desire in ways that are, I think, indistinguishable from Sheilaism.
Yeah, and I should say, I think you bring out in the book that these are oftentimes connected to certain kinds of political projects, oftentimes of a progressive variety, for instance. So that obviously has a sort of wider dimension, though even those political projects are often for the sake of some kind of liberation of the self and sort of like these identitarian kinds of concerns, whether on the left or the right. I think that's certainly there. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to others who have comments, questions. I can come around with the mic. Sebastian?
Hello. Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask about your thoughts concerning this demographic of being spiritual but not religious, and thinking of emerging this is a distinctive status that maybe we can say emerges in the secular age specifically. Would you say that the individuals that self-identify as secular but not religious I'm sure they wouldn't explicitly, at least a lot of them, identify themselves as I'm a neo-paganist, and I'm participating in specific ancient practices that they're explicitly drawing on. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Would you say they're at least implicitly drawing on, thinking about the history of religion, something like animist, tribalist, fetishist, totemist, early religion, kinds of pantheist? And I think you partially got at this with what you were saying about like the energies and manifesting. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts specifically on the demographic of people who identify as spiritual but not religious, and if you see them as implicitly located in one of those, or all of them, or yeah.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think some of the way that we might read back quote unquote paganism, or how we think about it now, is more maybe informed by 19th century visions of the pagan than either from the sort of Taylor anthropological perspective or the Nietzsche sort of return perspective than perhaps was strictly warranted. And I think what's interesting about, for example, something like neo-paganism as a sort of post-New Age thought system, is that at least in the Greek and particularly the Roman world, paganism is a civil religion. It is an observance for the polis. It is something that was not traditionally about your own personal mystical religious traditions, and in fact it is only in the development of various mystery cults that we find something kind of quite different. So I wouldn't necessarily, and I'm not a specialist on kind of sort of animism to speak too authoritatively about it, but I do think that actually what we find in let's say New Age ideas and practices, and those even people who are not, let's say, Wiccan or neo-pagan, but are in dialogue with neo-paganism and New Age, are in dialogue with New Agey ideas or manifesting or New Thought. I do actually think it's the Hermetic tradition, the tradition of learned magic, that is a close analog, which is not to say everybody who is spiritual but not religious is a Hermetic magician, poring over the Corpus Hermeticum, casting spells. I don't think that at all. But what I do think is that a lot of the language and vocabulary and ideas around energy and one's place in it and self-divinization and kind of particularly that personal component, which I think is not really part of historical pagan practice, this idea that, there's what would one call even vibes. That very much, I think, is wedded to, I won't say a historical place and time, because this is not the only religious ideology that where you might find it. But I see it, for example, when I say Hermetism, I'm referring both to a sort of what becomes a later magical tradition, but what starts out as a kind of offshoot of Neoplatonism in late antique Alexandria, actually developing around the same time as what would become Orthodox Christianity, where in fact it is sort of through various interpretations of Plato about the energies of the world and the force of the world, and the self's ability to kind of go both inward and through knowledge ascend towards God. Those images come up again and again from the Renaissance onward, both in the magical or the esoteric tradition as a historical phenomenon, and then particularly become popularized first, a big figure here is Jung, like in Jungian psychoanalysis, and then in New Age thought. So I do think there is a specific historical lineage we can look at, but I'm not sure that actual pagan practice, at least to my knowledge of the classical world, it would be the place I'd go.
Ellen.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming, and the excellent book. I enjoy reading your writing. I'm kind of wondering about the rise of purveyors of
might not be working.
rites and new religions in relation to changing understandings of family. So I put the question this way. Do those that you study in your book change their perspective typically when they become parents?
I think, so that's an open question in part just because I think we're only just going to be now seeing that. The big drop-offs of millennials and Generation Z are, millennials in particular having children later. I don't think we have data on what that looks like yet, or whether being raised. I mean, I think certainly from the data of people growing up in homes where religion isn't that much spoken of, continuing that trend and becoming less religion. I don't know if we're going to get a kind of like Family Ties-esque scenario where a bunch of people raised nuns are going to, seek out traditional Catholicism. Although
I totally get that reference.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. I think I do imagine that one of the things that one needs as a parent is a kind of community, and sources of that will be desirable. It is also true that a lot of these practices and communities do not tend to be child-friendly or kind of compatible with family life in a certain way. I think there are the assumption, if you go into Soul Cycle or what have you, or wellness culture, is that these are private and these are individual, and they are best accessed if you have free time and money, which perhaps is a little harder if you are a parent. But I think that I think that we do not yet have the kind of statistical information about the next generation that would help me give like a authoritative answer on what will happen, just because it's happening now.
And then a student's up next. Some students got it bravely, not just Sebastian.
Thank you for the talk in the book. I wanted to ask about truth and the role of truth in all this, and whether you think, traditionally it seems like religion as a search for God or a search for meaning even is somehow bound to this search for truth and a sort of external source of authority. And I'm just wondering whether you think that this remains in some incoherent form in these expositions or these sort of categories that you've given us for capturing religion. And if not, whether you think this makes this a kind of deficient manifestation of a religious sensibility that will have consequences, and if you could sort of talk about whether you have any sense of what you think they might be, that would be helpful.
I think you're completely right. You've identified what I think of as one of the biggest problems with these remixed religions, which is that they're primarily functional. How do you hear these four needs: meaning, purpose, ritual, community? How do they fill them? How do you fill them? Rather than what is in fact the meaning of life and what is my purpose? I think that another source of this sort of nihilism we talked about a little earlier is the sense that truth is only really functional. If it works for you, it doesn't matter, and therefore the purpose of it is to make you happy or feel self-actualized, or some kind of end goal that does again seem kind of psychological. These are psychological tools rather than metaphysical truth claims. And I think that thinking about religious life as merely a set of psychological tools, unrelated to reality, does at its core imply that either there is no such thing as truth, or at least there is no such thing as meaning, and there is no afterlife, and there is no God, and therefore this is just like to get you between now and death without feeling too bad about it. Which if you sort of think about it too much, turns to feel sort of existentially horrifying. So I think that absence of a search for truth, or an affirmation that these things are true, and if they're true, they sort of matter, is absolutely one of the most glaring and difficult absences in a lot of these remixed religions, and indeed in the idea that this is sort of purely a functional, personal, like what is a religion for ultimately? And I think you're right that without the assumption of truth claims, it all does fall apart. I think there's a secondary assumption too, which is not just that truth doesn't exist, but that truth is fungible. I think we talk sort of a lot of times colloquially about living in a post-truth era or a post-fact era, or there's the internet is an age of without truth. Up to a point, I actually think that's true. And what I mean by that is I think because truth, including like political and economic realities and certainly cultural realities, can be so easily shaped through this like access to mimetic discourse and that we just have by result of the internet. It is truer now than ever that changing someone's perceptions, whether or not you're telling the truth, by having a good meme, can in fact shape realities of the world. Like, can it, stop gravity? No, but can reality as a social fabric, as a political reality, as a cultural reality, be changed by individuals? Absolutely. And so I think that another way that the internet intensifies this sort of new religious nihilism is by rendering kind of literally true this esoteric idea that reality exists to be shaped by human beings. And I think that's sort of perhaps thrilling if you're the person doing the shaping, but then again also has its nihilistic core.
Yeah, I did wonder, I mean, like some of these, like the witches and so forth, like, did they really think they were witches, or is it just like playing at being a witch or being ironic? And so there was but I think with some of the doctrines you talk about, like the social justice commitments or the atavistic sort of orientation or techno-utopian, there is oftentimes like a deep commitment to like, this is a sense of the good maybe, but maybe they waver. It's like on the knife's edge of nihilism and some like maybe quasi-religious commitment perhaps.
Absolutely, and I actually think of the groups that you're describing, who, and this book was written in 2019, I saw as the three sort of snowball nexuses where religious remixing was kind of forming some kind of not fully coherent, but like roughly coherent worldview. And I would say of those, like, actually, insofar as social justice is sort of downstream of certain strains of Marxist thought, it actually does have, it is sort of more explicitly material, but has a clearer moral sense of purpose. Like, it's not nihilistic, even if it's much less nihilistic, actually, in certain ways, that there is a kind of eschatological vision of justice. Although, as I said in my talk earlier, I think that's perhaps the least, that group is perhaps the least successful of the three. And it seems that these sort of, the techno-utopian and the atavistic camps I identify have converged, in part because of their perhaps cultural resistance to the language and narrative of social justice, and have actually perhaps become a more potent force, perhaps precisely because they offer a kind of vision of enchantment, even if it is a vision of enchantment that does have a kind of perhaps morally nihilistic core. I mean,
yeah, great. Any students? Oh. Yeah, Claire? Sorry. You can hand it back to Amanda.
I know you talked about the internet like largely contributing to like the transition from like institutionalized religion to like individualized spirituality. But do you think like anything, because like it's like a sudden rise within like the past few decades, do you think there's like any other like big contributing like factor to this, or?
So I'd say.
Sorry, I just was getting the mic.
Oh, okay. I think the internet is the biggest one, but I think it's also part of a bigger story, which is to say, I think we have the one strand of it, which is American religious intuitionalism and sort of American cultural hegemony exporting that in a certain way. I think we have the internet as the biggest piece, and then we have a kind of other the post-60s counterculture story and the story of the sexual revolution and visions of human perfectibility and human freedom that come into play in that way. And we have the kind of broader story of the story of modernity, which of course, not unbroken, and to call it that is to be a bit reductionist, but there is of course a story, a wider story of the decline in authority of religious institutions and the rise of certain kinds of humanistic and transhumanistic thoughts made possible by the development of technology. So I think that all of these stories are in play, and then the internet sort of propels them into overdrive. And that is why I like the example of the printing press, actually, as a sort of similar watershed moment where technological development allows us to be new ways of thinking about being human, or new ways of understanding and testing out our own humanity.
Amanda?
Okay. This kind of touches on what you were speaking about earlier in terms of transcendence and morality, but I was wondering, with the spiritual remix, is there still a necessity for an institution to answer the cosmic question of the meaning of life? Or can new forms of religion give us a source of this vertical transcendence over one that's just immanent? And if it is just immanent, can we have a substantial moral base, and would this still allow for a cohesive moral order?
That's a great question. So, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking, are there certain forms of, let's say, immanent religious experience that are perhaps either not making truth claims or not making the kind of truth claims that can be held by an institutional body, what the relationship of that to kind of the moral side would be? Yeah, okay, got you right. Great. I think that individuals, let's assume, for the purpose of argument, that I have a religious experience that is true, that is real, that is an encounter with God, but it does not kind of come with a clear-cut vocabulary that I can share with others that allows me to sort of process what, in fact, I have seen. I think I am very open to that existing and happening, but I think that one of the sort of difficulties is how that goes. Whatever happens cannot go beyond one person without perhaps a process. As soon as you put it into language, you're losing something in translation. And what that I think does mean is that it might whatever is happening in a kind of mystical experience is not necessarily sustainable or transmittable. And then the question kind of remains is, if there are ways in which religious experience that is true might occur through certain practices, or through maybe even LSD, or is it one way that sort of people sort of thought that they could have an experience, but perhaps without certain claims involved. Then I think what you can have moral commitments that come downstream of that. You can come away with a renewed sense of love and purpose, but how this gets communicated and transmitted, I think, would be much harder. But I think a question that I have, and that I actually both David and I are going to be this next weekend in Montreal with the philosopher Charles Taylor, who just wrote this incredible book called Cosmic Connections, where he talks about certain kinds of poetry or poetic language as orienting us towards the existence of the real or reality without necessarily making claims about it, except that it exists, that we're sort of oriented towards a stance of realism while recognizing that we don't necessarily have the words to describe what is going on. Now, I think a kind of fair critique is, he's just sort of talking about God without not talking about God. He's obviously coming at this from a Christian perspective. But I do think that it is true that there are experiences that orient us towards a kind of realism without making propositional claims about what that is, and that art does appear to be one of those experiences. So I'm sort of enough of a sort of aesthete psychologically to feel like maybe beauty can actually get us some of the way there. But I think that in a pluralistic society, when you're not kind of expecting everyone to have the same truth claims or knowledge claims, there are limits on how much any religious or transcendent mystical experience, even if they were in fact real and true, can be transmitted or shared within a social body. This is why I like the theater so much. I think it does actually it does something, even if it doesn't get us to truth claims. It perhaps orients us towards the idea that truth claims can be made.
So maybe we'll just one more, maybe short question, because I know we're kind of running up on time here.
It kind of runs into the idea of awakening and what constitutes an awakening. You know, it's often said right now this is a period of an awakening, and I guess that's what my question is. What constitutes that?
I think sort of traditionally when we're talking about the Great Awakenings in American religious history, we're talking about periods of religious fervor and a sense that there's that the divine is present and that our kind of emotional relationship to it is important, that there's a reality that we are awakening to. Separately, I think the language of awakening and what is sort of called wokeness, I feel like that's sort of pejorative, and I don't mean it pejoratively, but it does come out of this sort of different vision of awakening, which is that there's a shared cultural sense that of a reality that has not been elucidated, that we're sort of aware of certain social structures that are bad or harmful but taken for granted, and now we are awake to them. That's sort of the origin of that particular vision of what it means of awakening. But I think that maybe a way of sort of synthesizing that or framing it is that an awakening is a period where the social imaginary, in the social imaginary, we love Charles Taylor here on the stage, becomes sort of, there's a shared conviction that certain things taken for granted about the social order or practices are insufficient, and that a sort of shared exploration of possibilities beyond what is socially constructed and given are necessary to sort of ideally collectively apprehend more accurately the truth. And that doesn't mean that like all awakenings are correct or true or not true, but that seems to be the sort of shared feature, and that there's a sort of a shared sense we've all missed something, and at this moment in history, for whatever reason, cultural development, technological development, cultural shift, we can see ways that what we take for granted has occluded us to what is true.
Well, thank you very much. So I just want to sort of wrap up this conversation by saying I think it's very helpful to kind of have this framing of these different spiritual possibilities. I think one of the challenges that, this is something Charles Taylor talks about, living in a secular age means we live with this sense of this growing optionality of different existential and spiritual perspectives. So I think I'm very grateful, Tara, for your work, for helping to frame some of these different spiritual possibilities. Of course, we still have the old-timey religions, and those are going to continue to be attractive to many people, and they give an orientation. But at the same time, we see this spiritual hunger and people reaching out for different options. So I think this is something from Taylor to articulate, to give words to these different kinds of spiritual longing, spiritual experience, I think is a great pathway towards, seeking out that fulfillment in our lives. So I want to thank all of you for coming here and joining in this conversation. And if you're one of my students, there was a paper going around you could sign into. If you just come out, is it over here? Over here. It's over here. So if you haven't signed that, please sign that in. But thank you, students, and thank you, friends, and thank you, colleagues and others for coming out today. Again, 2 weeks from 2 weeks from now, on November 19th, we have another conversation with John Cottingham on philosophy of religion in an age of growing non-religion. But please join me in thanking Tara Isabella Burton for joining us today.